Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of Bill C-52, an act to amend the Canada Transportation Act. And, Mr. Speaker, before I get going, I can't but help but mention that here we are again, trying to debate an important piece of legislation, and yet this government has moved time allocation once again. And this is the 37th time. The question I have is, what does this government have against parliamentary democracy? And why are they so determined to shut down debate and to prevent members of parliament from getting up and having their say in important pieces of legislation? And my colleague said how important this legislation is. And because it is so important, I am really disappointed that the Conservatives had to use these tactics yet again. But when we look at this bill actually gives our rail freight customers or shippers the right to service agreements with rail companies, especially CN and CP. And it also puts into a place, as my colleague said, Canadian Transportation Agency-led arbitration process for failed negotiations and penalties for violating the arbitration results. This all sounds good, Mr. Speaker, but I want us to take a look at what this means. And by the way, we're speaking in favour of this because we believe this bill is not complete. It doesn't address all the issues that the shippers and the farmers and everybody really needed to address. But what it does it goes part of the way. So we call this bill a baby step in the right direction. And that's why, because you should always reward good behaviour, and because it is a piece of legislation going in the right direction, and because we have heard that this will alleviate not all the challenges faced by the shippers, but it will go a long way in addressing a few of them. So it's one of those cases of better something than nothing. And that's why we're supporting this bill. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I really want to acknowledge the work done by the member from Trinity Spadina on this file. An amazing critic for the transportation file, dedicated, passionate, and she has worked incredibly hard with different organizations of shippers, with representatives from the mining companies, from the pulse growers, from the wheat boards, with all of them, automotive movement, minerals, chemicals, you name it. And it's her commitment and her passion and her not letting go of this issue that I believe has forced the Conservative government to bring this bill to this House right now, because quite honestly, they have really been dilly-dallying over this piece of legislation for a very long time. Long after the report was out, they've had lots of time to act. But the absolute advocacy and the outreach done by the member from Trinity Spadina and her private member's bill, C-441, the Rail Customer Act, and it's that advocacy and that kind of work in the House and also pressure from the shipping community that has put pressure on the Conservatives to table legislation. And I think we should always give credit when members of Parliament put in an incredible amount of work to benefit our farmers, our mining companies, our automotive companies that have to move cars, and of course all the other resource industry as well, including our forestry. So we are absolutely delighted with the work that she has done. And when I look at this legislation, I also want to pick up on something that was said just a few minutes ago, and that is, CN made a profit of $2.7 billion in 2012, in 1 year, in 2012. And yet when I look at the penalty that they have to face, by the way, the penalty, they don't pay the shippers, they pay the government, the penalty is $100,000. And I look at that and I think, okay, so which lobby group has really been successful? And you just have to take a look at this bill. And I have talked with shippers in my riding. I've actually visited one of those port entries where the grain and the legumes. And Mr. Speaker, this is where I learned something absolutely amazing. And you'll be surprised at this as well. Did you know that Canada is the largest provider of pulses to India? I, in my naivety, always thought that the lentils and the chickpeas and all of those legumes, that we were bringing them in to Canada from India and other countries. And I was quite shocked to find out. And actually, it was the Canadian consul in Chandigarh who told me this. And he presented the figures and he said, did you know that Canada is the largest exporter of legumes to India? And a lot of those legumes go through the port of Vancouver and through the port of Delta. And what I've heard from the business people in my community, from those who receive and ship, is the travesty that exists right now, where they actually have to wait, and sometimes wait for days and days because the promised carriages don't arrive. Where, if they don't unload a trolley, I think you call it a trolley when it arrives, they actually end up having to pay fines if they're slow in emptying the trolleys. But there is no consequences for the railway company if they are either late, or if they don't send enough trolleys, or if the trolleys that arrive are damaged and therefore cannot be used. And I actually looked at the ledger in great detail with one of these business people who wanted to see me, who wanted to show me actually, maybe he wanted to see me too, but he actually wanted to show me the impact it was having on his business. So let's say that he doesn't get the shipment on time. The shipment of pulses that arrives from our prairies doesn't get to his place on time. In the meantime, he's not only got trucks and truck drivers, he's actually got labor sitting there waiting to unload, and then he's got time booked at the port. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? He has to pay all of those. He has to pay all of those through no fault of his own, just because the railway company is delayed or because they don't deliver all the trolleys that he was expecting on that date. And Mr. Speaker, I actually thought it must just be a few dollars here and there. I was actually surprised at how much these shippers actually pay if they don't empty the trolleys on time. But I was also shocked at the port fees they still had to pay if they didn't take up their spot, and how the costs escalated the longer they waited. So really, we're not talking about simple costing here. And yet this bill has compensation, well, not compensation, has a slight penalty for the railway companies, $100,000. When you make $2.7 billion profit, $100,000. But guess who that money goes to? It doesn't go to offset the real costs incurred by the shippers and receivers, those who grow and move and then ship the goods. Actually, that amount goes to the government. And I've been kind of shaking my head at that one a little bit, thinking, this makes very little sense. So, does the government really have a vested interest in making sure that this new piece of legislation really works, if they know that every time CN is late, they're going to get $100,000? That doesn't seem like a penalty. That seems like the government has built in a bonus for themselves. And I think we have to really, really take a look at that. And, you know, our railway system is the backbone of our country. There is no doubt about it. From the early CPCN stories we have all read about, glorious and not so glorious, we know that 70% of our surface goods are moved by rail, And that's a significant amount. That's a significant amount. So when we say that there are shippers who actually suffer as a consequence of this, we're not talking about a small number of people. And this is another figure, Mr. Speaker, that absolutely astounded me. It's 80% of service commitments for agricultural rail customers are not met by rail companies. 80%. Well, you know, I think that would get a big, big F if I was grading them for service. So let's say out of 100 times, 80 times they fail to meet their deadlines. 80 times. And we're talking about produce that has to be moved quickly. People are waiting for it. We're also talking about some produce that actually could get spoiled. But we're also talking about the ricochet or the cascading costs that I just mentioned to you earlier. There are delays. There are insufficient numbers of rail cars. Some rail cars arrive and they're damaged. And sometimes you order 12 rail cars, and guess how many arrive? For this particular person I was talking to, you know, you may only get half the rail cars you have ordered. And that, again, puts all kinds of stress on the system. And, you know, once again, when you look at the losses incurred by the shippers, this bill fails to address that. And I would urge my colleagues, even at this late stage, because it's in their hands, that they should really, really take a look at that. The Rail Freight Service Review actually said that 80% of shippers are not satisfied. And by the way, we're not talking about one industry. Of course, agriculture plays a huge, huge role in this area, but we're also talking about forestry, we're talking about other natural resources, we're talking about manufactured goods, we're talking about mining, we're talking about chemicals, and of course, you know, as I said earlier, all the agricultural bills. And there are key stakeholders. As much as I don't like that word, I couldn't think of another one, Mr. Speaker. In agriculture, mining and forestry industry, all these different associations, not just individual people, but associations representing these industries are calling for have been calling for freight legislation for years. Let me give you an example. Pulse Canada, Grain Growers of Canada, Forestry Products Association of Canada, Mining Association of Canada. And once again, I would say that as I have talked with many business people in my community who are involved in the shipping industry, they have been so full of praise for the member from Trinity Spadina who has done such great work on this file. And you know, Mr. Speaker, Canada's shippers deserve fair and reliable rail freight service for the good money they are paying. Now, right now, as you know, with the way our country is, CN and CP seem to hold a dual monopoly. And that monopoly and the impact of that monopoly has not been addressed by Bill C-52 because the one area that has not been addressed is pricing. And that's a critical part as well. You know, not only pricing, but also no compensation for the shippers. By the way, Mr. Speaker, there were 6 recommendations from the shipping community at the committee stage. Sensible, practical, and modest. Can you believe that? And they were all rejected. By the way, this is an all too familiar pattern. I sit at the Immigration Committee as Vice Chair, and it doesn't seem to matter what amendments we take to there. Even amendments that the Minister thinks would be really good ones, and we take up his wording, they just get rejected. But here, these were not amendments from the opposition. These were amendments suggested by the shipping community, the business community, the people who are the backbone of this country, who pay taxes and were looking to this government to show them a level playing field. And once again, this government has failed to show a level playing field to all the industries I mentioned, including agriculture, and once again chose to stand closer to the big corporate friends like the railway lines, CP and CN. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know that the NDP is not going to give up. We're not planning to go away. We're planning to work harder than ever. And we will continue to work with the shipping community to tackle the issue of gouging through uncompetitive rail freight rates. And you know what? This was an opportunity for this government to address that issue, to actually do a holistic and take a holistic approach instead of taking a baby step, a very tiny baby step nevertheless. And Mr. Speaker, we can all say in here and talk about the economy, we can actually talk about growing jobs, and we can talk about all kinds of issues. But here was a concrete opportunity for this government to do something that would actually help to bolster our economy, would actually help to bolster agriculture, the mining industry, the forestry industry, and the automotive industry. And once again, they were very short-sighted and have just decided to take a baby step. And when I take a look at this, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we have to take a look at is that when we're looking at moving of goods, and when we think 80%, was it 80 or 70? Let me just go back to that. When you think 70% of our goods are moved by rail, surface goods, by rail, in this huge country, by the way. And by the way, the rail, as we know, moving goods by rail is much more environmentally sound than it is to move them by road. But considering all of that, they actually had an opportunity at this time to actually support the pulse growers, the grain growers, the mining industry, and the forestry industry. And we know that disruptions to rail freight services and unacceptable service costs actually cost the Canadian economy hundreds of millions of dollars every year. The businessmen I've talked to, when I've taken a look at the losses they incur, Mr. Speaker, when they incur those losses, they impact the community I live in. Okay? They actually impact right across this country. And few of the business people have been telling me that they absolutely...
Order. Yeah. The honourable member for Newton North Delta has the floor.
I know it's late at night, but I would really urge my colleagues to
Order.
calm down that excitement.
Order.
Let's just wait.
Order.
And,
Order. The honourable member for Newton North Delta, currently, when the speaker's standing, typically he has the floor. So we'll just ask all honourable members. I know it is getting on, but when another honourable member has the floor, we would certainly ask that you yield that. The honourable member, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for reminding me, and my apologies. No lack of respect meant by that at all. So, anyway, when the Canadian economy, because of the lateness of the rail cars that arrive, or because of the state they arrive in, or because of all the other delays, actually costs the economy hundreds of millions of dollars. And that ricochets right across communities across Canada, and actually then pay into the price for the goods as well. And quite honestly, it damages our international reputation as well. As I told you, can you believe it? Canada is the largest shipper of legumes to India. Never would have believed it if I hadn't found that out for myself. Anyway, rotting crops, idled plants and mines, and missed ships are a daily reality for industries across Canada. So, Mr. Speaker, I know that you're thinking that it's maybe time that it's time for me to stop talking, but just 1 minute I think you said I had. So the NDP staff stands with the farmers, mining and forestry communities.
No, there wasn't 1 minute remaining.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Speaker, I misread you.
I'm sure they